Okay, hey, welcome to an episode of On the Wrist from Off the Cuff. To have a really cool little comparison for you guys, we're really going to look at the best affordable big brand integrated steel sports watches in 2026. On your left, of course, you're going to kind of have what started, or I shouldn't say started, but really capitalized on this craze, which is going to be the Tissot PRX Powermatic 80 in blue. Which is an outstanding watch, but it has gone up in price over the years. Originally retailing for $650 in 2026, it retails for $850. So quite a price jump over the years. In the middle, we have one of the first, I think, real contenders in terms of mainstream popularity, which is this beautiful Citizen Tsuyosa. Now, in terms of price point here, we're going to go $475 full retail or just $290 from Sakura Watches. And then on the end here, we have a newer watch, not super brand new, but this is the Edifice automatic. It has been sold out in various places. So you probably haven't seen as much coverage on these as you should, because I think this is a really cool piece. These retail for only $280, or you can get them for $218 from Sakura. I'll also leave a discount code in the description for an additional 3% off. But as I've kind of reviewed each of these watches in the past and some more recently, I do think they do compare really well against each other, and I like that they kind of give you some options. Of course, when you think about the Powermatic 80 from from Tissot, the PRX Powermatic 80 in this case, it's a great watch, especially when you compare it, right? Even at the $850, when you compare it to some of its Swiss contemporaries. And then you can completely undercut it with this new Citizen or Casio, which I think is a little wild, because they have very similar specs apart from the extended power reserve. So, with that though, they do have some other things that I think play well really for each of these models. So with all that said, let's go ahead, zoom the camera out, get these pieces in hand, and take a closer look. Okay, now all three of these, of course, they have a similar theme in the fact that they're all steel sports watches on integrated bracelets, but they do have very different approaches to that formula. We can start off with, again, the one that kind of helped really mainstream popularize this resurgence of these watches. Now, in terms of the dimensions here, you're getting 40 millimeters across with just 11.2 millimeters thick. Also about 44.1 millimeters lug to lug, and that is looking at the actual case itself. But when we look at these protruding end links that are, basically not even, they're not even articulated. They extend the case. You get it out to about 51.2 millimeters. But this is a looker. It wears really well. You guys have seen these everywhere, and including my channel when these were first released. Very, very strong release. Very cool watch. But you have watches like this Citizen Tsuyosa that has done really, really well for itself, and it is also at 40 millimeters, but it's only 11.8 millimeters thick, which is slightly thicker, but still under 12 millimeters. And then you have about 44.7 millimeter lug to lug width, but that is, of course, not counting that initial end link, which also does extend out that footprint to actually about 49.5 millimeters lug to lug. I'll give it a quick little wipe here because it does have polished center links. But for me, this real strong attribute of this watch is going to be this dial execution. Look at how clean it is. Look at the bevel on that date window. You can see it through the magnifying window there. It is very, very clean, very, very crisp. Not going to be in terms of the case work and the bracelet. It's probably the cheapest feeling of the set here with this stamped clasp all the way around. But I will say each of these are, we've got split pins essentially. There's no screw pins to be found here. But then the newcomer to the group here, and it's not brand new, but it is definitely on the newer side, and you're going to see less reviews for this piece. This is your Casio Edifice automatic, and this thing is very, very cool. in terms of the dimensions, only 38.8 millimeters across, which is going to be the smallest of the group. And then it also squeezes that dial down by having that slope chaptering and you know, some of the additional sectioning that's happening here, that it really does help this wear quite small. So with that 38.8, so just under 39 millimeters across, it's 12.5 millimeters thick though, because of that Seiko movement inside. It is rather chunky. And then also the lug to lug is extended by a bit of a male end link as well. But if we were to look at the numbers here, about 43.5 millimeters lug to lug when you think about the ends of the case. But if you go by the ultimate lug to lug, it would be closer to 48.5, which is still shorter than the other two models. So this is going to have a nice wear to it. I will say that the bracelet is quite well executed. Definitely a lot closer to the PRX versus the Tsuyosa, especially when you consider the nice milled sections here. And then the crazy thing is, this is the cheapest one, which is, you know, pretty outstanding. And again, even if you paid full retail for this, $280, if you can find it at full retail, again, these are selling out very, very quickly. It's very, very impressive. I mean, look at that forged carbon style dial there. Very, very nice pattern. Gives you, you know, those kind of quote unquote snowflake, you know, dial vibes that you love from Grand Seiko. Of course, this is not meant to be a snowflake, but I will say that's kind of the closest thing that it evokes at a glance. And you can see here, this reverse waffle style dial, again, also brings out some really, really fantastic details in terms of just something that is quite simple, but not plain and not boring. There's, you know, you have so many layers and textures that are here that come together really quite nicely. Both cases here, these are going to be both busier dials versus this option, which is going to be a very simple, very clean. And I mean, in terms of its aesthetic, you can think something like a Rolex Datejust, or, you know, something like that, an Oyster Perpetual, especially with this robin's egg kind of Tiffany bluish dial. It's going to be some, but up here, of course, you get the nice refinement of that beautiful, subtle sunray pattern. So this is a cool one. I mean, they're all very, very nice. Of course, they all have different movements. Let's talk about the three different movement options here. We have the Powermatic 80, which is going to give you an 80-hour power reserve beat at 3 hertz. These all three do beat at 3 hertz. Where the Citizen is going to have a 42-hour power reserve. It also does hack and hand wind, which not all 8200 movements do. This is 8210 from Miyota. And then here we actually have inside of the Citizen, it is a Seiko Instruments NH35A, which has a 41-hour power reserve, also beats at 3 hertz. So probably going to be one of the more robust and easily serviceable and adjustable, because it is, you know, a very ubiquitous movement in general, but it is going to be a little bit thicker, which, you know, it does add that thickness. But I will say it still does have full 100 meters of water resistance to match the Tissot versus the Tsuyosa, which is going to feel a bit more on the dressier side with only the 50 meters of water resistance, or 5 bar. So there's definitely a lot that these share in common, but I think, you know, they do bring their own signature aesthetic to the genre. And I mean, I think you couldn't go wrong with either, you know, any of these three, but I think they're different enough to where you could probably own all three, be weirdo like me, and, you know, still be able to enjoy them for what makes them different, but, you know, keep it as almost like a weird mini collection for what they have in common. So with that said, let's actually get these on the wrist and see how they wear. Okay, we'll start with this classic Tissot PRX. They have had released other sizes, but for my 7.5-inch wrist, this one's been the best thus far. I have yet to try out their new 38mm sizing. I'm imagining it would be great. I would be weary about how drastic the taper is on the bracelet. I would love a slightly smaller case, but with a similar taper on the bracelet. I don't like it to overly taper because unfortunately that makes the watch feel a bit undersized in my opinion, and that's kind of the downfall of many integrated steel sports watches on the market today. Of course, if I get my wrist a bit too close to the camera lens, it's going to make the watch seem a lot more large and bulbous, and you can see the sides of my wrist fall away there. My wrist is 7.5 inches, or it's 19 centimeters in circumference. But if I keep my wrist nice and low and then just tighten up the frame like so, the nice thing is you're going to be able to get still a detailed look, but just add a bit of a true aspect ratio as how this may lay on your own wrist. And you can see very, very nice. The height doesn't bother me one bit. This bracelet, the light play, again, it just evokes a lot more expensive vibes, even at the new elevated price of about $850. Now, here we go. A very popular contemporary here from Citizen, the Tsuyosa, and this thing wears really wonderfully. It actually reminds me a lot of my SNX Seiko 5 series. It just happens to have an integrated bracelet style. So you're going to get a lot of versatility here. I think this looks quite good. I will say this has the worst crown to actuate. It is way, way undersized. I think visually it looks great tucked away there, but I wish they would have just worked a little bit harder to get something that was going to feel a bit more ergonomic. I love the details on this dial. Super crisp, super clean, super sharp. Really, really well done. And let's go, again, quick side by side. Not side by side, but just, seeing how they differ. And then with that, we'll actually swap in this very handsome Casio, which is so weird to even think about. Yes, I'm swapping on a Casio mechanical watch. And wow, look at that. This thing is impressive. Now, the wild thing for me is, although this is the cheapest watch here at just over $200, guys, there's a part of me that thinks that a blind test, some might assume this is the most expensive watch. If they didn't see the Casio name, I feel like when you look at this, they did a lot to make sure that this watch would have great details. Look at this. Look at the light play, the angles, the multiple finishes. Very, very sharply done. I love the depth in the dial. Let's compare here. Of course, a lot flatter. Still going to get a lot of light play, but just this is going to feel a lot more retro and aesthetic. Whereas here you're going to feel a lot more contemporary. Definitely no throwback retro 70s vibes here. It is integrated, but I mean, at a glance, you might not even think that this is an integrated bracelet. I think it still looks quite good though. And for those of you that do collect Casios, which, I mean, my sons collect Casios, I collect Casios. The cool thing is that this is like kind of a really attainable grail, right? Like, I have some very expensive G-Shocks, but this, and on the Casio side, on the Edifice side, this is very, very cool as kind of like a reverse halo. Like, this is, you might only wear those vintage Casio digital watches, and then this might be your only, watch of this style when you have the analog readout. Whereas here on this side, I think the Tissot PRX is just, it's like a Seiko 5 in terms of being a safe bet in any collection. No one's going to question this, like, this is just the type of watch you get on your way to all of the cliche watches, like a Speedmaster, Moonwatch, or a Submariner, right? Or a Rolex Explorer. These watches absolutely fit within that same type of thing where it's almost just a given. Like, you should have something like this, and not everybody can afford an AP Royal Oak, or not everybody wants to find a really cool oyster quartz Rolex from the 70s, right? So very, very cool, all three of these watches. But with that said, let's actually get them off the wrist, set up for some Lume shots, the light transition, and closing thoughts. Okay, let's go ahead and hit the lights here. All right. Again, each one of these watches have different attributes. The Citizen really shining in terms of its lume, whereas the Tissot and the Casio are really just like not exciting from that perspective. But one thing I always like to work in is going to be a bit of a low light transition, because you're always going to be out in the middle of a field enjoying direct sunlight. A lot of times you're going to find yourself coming out of buildings, walking underneath overhangs, or just hanging out underneath the shade of a tree. So it's nice to see what these colors, textures, and finishes render like in less than optimal lighting. And I mean, apart from the Citizen, which this might be what puts you over the edge, while somebody might like the dial details or the handsets, or the bracelets, the clasp construction. You might be somebody that's like, I need my lume. So we'll even give it a little bit of a supercharge here. Of course, the Casio it only has loomed hour and minute hands, whereas you get kind of the full Monty there on the Citizen in the middle, and then a very unfortunate razor thin application for the Tissot. But I will say again, these aren't dive watches. These aren't some tactical watch where you really need to have low light legibility. It is nice to have it, but at the end of the day, you're not always going to be in a pitch black darkened room trying to look at your watch. A lot of times there'll be some level of lighting, and as you can see here, there's going to be still quite, a decent amount of legibility thanks to just the standard contrast apart from the lume. I mean, there isn't even a lume on the dial indices on that Casio, and it's still looking good. So, and still quite legible. But ooh, man, ooh yeah, look at these. I love the dials here. I love the difference between each one of these dials. I love that they bring something different to the party. So, with that said, we'll get the lights back on here and get into some closing thoughts, guys. So for me, if I just sum this all up for the bottom line, even at its elevated price point in 2026, the PRX does still feel more expensive, but not 2 or 3 times more expensive than the Citizen or Casio here. I think you really can't go wrong with any of these, but I do think that if you don't really love the PRX necessarily, and maybe just love the idea of it, right? Like you just want an integrated steel sports watch, I really do think it's absolutely worth it to check out either of these other 2 options. I mean, even at full price, you can have both the Citizen and Casio here for less than the price of the automatic Tissot PRX. So consider that, right? Because you can still get a lot of diversity, even though they're both integrated bracelets, right? I mean, if you think about it, how many of your watches are not integrated bracelets? And you don't really cross shop those against each other. So, in this case, I do think these watches, each of them are different enough to have all 3, or maybe you say, hey, with that money, I could have 2 fun watches that are still relatively mainstream. Tissot, of course, does a lot of marketing within sports. But Citizen is definitely a very, very much a household name. Same for Casio. I love that there's a bit of a story to all 3 of these watches. There's a real cool story behind this Tissot that even if you're a collector, understanding the story behind it, I think is fun. Same goes for the Citizen. You might see Citizen as this kind of, department store brand, but this particular model, again, it has a story. Same goes for the Edifice from Casio. This is their first mechanical watch. This is, their first mechanical analog watch, and I think that's cool. And there's definitely, again, there's a story to that. It's not just a cool looking watch. It's about what also is happening, and these watches, they're not just timepieces, they're conversation pieces as well to get into the madmen of it, if you recognize that quote. So with that said, let me know what you all think down in the comments below. If you like the video, please like, and if you already, please subscribe for more content just like this. Thanks, guys.